Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation. Just to let you know, we'll start in about 1 minute. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you once again for joining us. Just to let you know, we'll start the presentation in about 30 seconds. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast, Building Trust, Fostering Psychological Safety in the Workplace, sponsored by Avetta. This is Alan Ferguson, Associate Editor with Safety and Health. I'll be monitoring today's event. Thank you so much for joining us. And before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speaker and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council of the magazine endorses those items. After today's presentation, we'll conduct a question-answer session with our speaker. If you have a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and press the send button. We welcome your questions at any time during today's event. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to begin. Just to let you know, we might not get to every question, but the good news is unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. Also, after this presentation, we'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. This webcast will be archived so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events, or you may receive a link in our post-event email. With that, let's introduce our speaker. With us today is Nicole Osborne, Manager of QHSE, Operational Excellence at Avetta. Nicole has more than 10 years of global experience in multi-industry QHSE contractor management, supporting roles focused on compliance, safety, quality, and process optimization. Nicole is also a Dallas-based certified safety professional and certified quality auditor, who holds a bachelor's in health science from the University of West Florida and a master's in public health, focusing on occupational safety and health from Texas A&M University. Again, we thank you all for tuning in this presentation. Nicole, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Alan. And greetings, everybody. As Alan mentioned, today we should be discussing this important event that affects us all in our lives. It's building trust and fostering psychological safety in our workforce. So by the end of the session today, you should have a clear understanding of what psychological safety is, why it's critical, and how we build more trust and a psychological safe environment for our employees. Alan just did a quick introduction for me, so I'll skip over this slide here. But for today, we'll go into a couple different topics, tackling this first by understanding what psychological safety is. We'll define it, we'll give some descriptions to this. Then we'll go into assessing your own journey with psychological safety, where you're at today and how we move the ball forward. We'll go into building trust in our own employees, how we gain that trust of our employees, what some steps that we can make. And then that really builds upon the fostering of a psychological safe environment for our employees, which we'll end with. Okay. So kicking things off with just an understanding of psychological safety. Before I get into definitions or importance of anything, I think it's easy to understand this if we just put this in a descriptor of a comparison, right? So if we have two companies, they're both construction companies. They have workers, including engineers, foremen, laborers. They're all working together to build a project, right? So the first company, we'll just call them Bob's Construction, right? They really try to ensure that there's an open line for communication for their employees. So when on site, we have a construction worker, Sam, who notices a section of scaffolding that appears to be unstable. Sam feels confident and comfortable of bringing that issue immediately to his supervisor. His supervisor then can assess the scaffold, identify any problems, and then ensures that it's repaired, which prevents any injuries or illnesses from occurring from that situation, right? Also at Bob's Construction, they really try to build up team collaboration, working amongst their teams with ideas. So during a meeting, one of their junior engineers has a suggestion to streamline a process, right? So that junior engineer brings up that situation in the next team meeting. The team discusses it as a group and they decide, yes, this makes sense. Let's go ahead and try this new process. And through that process of implementing it, they identify that this improves the quality and reduces the cost of this process, right? Also at Bob's Construction, they try to enforce or explain to their employees that there's not a blame culture here. We want you to explain or bring up issues when they occur. So when John's on site and he identifies that there's a structural issue, he talks about it in his next team briefing, right? They try to understand what went wrong without blaming anybody for mistakes. Through this, they identify root causes, they make corrections to those, as well as look at some trainings that they can have or some process improvements that they can have to prevent this from happening in the future. Now, if we take a very, very similar construction company, but instead of being Bob's Construction Company, it's now Sarah's Construction Company, and they handle things a little bit differently at their company, right? So first, there's a little bit of a fear of speaking up. So at Sarah's Construction Company, when Jason notices an issue with scaffolding and it appears to be unstable, Jason doesn't want to say anything to his leaders. He doesn't want to build or bring anything up with a fear of reprimand or ridicule. So the scaffolding doesn't get addressed, nothing's repaired, and that leads to injuries from faulty scaffolding. At Sarah's Construction, there's also a lack of collaboration amongst teams. So when a junior engineer identifies a process to streamline, doesn't bring it up, doesn't discuss it with the team, which therefore any improvements never are realized. So it's continual inefficiencies and higher cost for that company, right? And then lastly, at Sarah's Construction Company, there's also a blaming culture. So when Ashley identifies a structural error during that inspection that could be potentially compromising to the structure of that building, she doesn't talk about it with her team. And that's because she's afraid somebody will be blamed or punished, maybe even herself. So the outcome is a root cause is never identified, corrections are never taken, and similar issues occurring in the future could happen, right? So with both of these situations, they're very similar companies, but they have different of how they're attacking psychological safety. One of them has a psychological safe environment that they're trying to build up with their employees. And then the other one is really lacking in that area, and it's a psychological unsafe environment. So I think this story kind of goes into a good descriptor of what we'll go into today. So what is psychological safety? Let's give a definition to this. Psychological safety is a climate where people feel safe to contribute their ideas, thoughts, and even challenges without a fear of humiliation or reprimand. There are many benefits of psychological safe environment and having that process built in and that culture built into your organization. But things that we've seen is it enhances employee engagement and satisfaction in their work. It boosts innovation and creativity when they bring ideas to the forefront. And then it also reduces turnover and increases esteem of those employees just by giving them something that they're giving input into the process. So we know what psychological safety is. we've given a definition to it. We know the benefits around psychological safety, but why do people still keep sticking their hands inside moving machinery? To understand this, we also have to take a look at how the mind works. So the workings of the conscious, the subconscious, the unconscious minds, which are fundamental in understanding behaviors. So when we're breaking down the mind, we think of this of parts that are percentages. The first one would be the conscious mind, that top 10%, what's happening right now. This includes everything that you're actively thinking right now, perceiving at this moment, right? So logical decision making, analytical thought processes. This also includes sensory, like sight, sound, touch. And then short-term memory. So memories that aren't long ingrained in our thoughts, but think of this as just remembering a phone number long enough for you to dial it, right? So these are the short-term conscious mind, what is happening today. It makes out about 10% of that consciousness. Going a little bit deeper, we have our subconscious mind, right? And our subconscious mind contains memories that we can readily access, easily access. We're not currently thinking about them today, but we can still recall them if we need that. So an example of this might be a learned behavior or skill. We're not driving right now, hopefully. We're not riding a bike. But if we needed to recall that, we could. Emotional response is also tied into this subconscious conscious area, right? So how do we react based off of experiences that we've had in the past? Routine actions or behaviors can go into this section as well. So habits that we've learned in repetition, and as well as patterns that we've identified historically. The very low end of this, or unconscious piece here, is the part of the mind that holds deep-seated beliefs, any repressed memories that we're not can't really call to, right? It influences our behaviors and our emotional response in ways that we don't really know and are hard to understand. So these are basic instinctual drives. It might be survival or aggression. This could be traumatic or distressing memories that we're repressing, so we don't recall them very frequently, as well as deep-seated beliefs or core beliefs, things that we've learned in our childhood that we carry over from time to time. So when we're thinking about the conscious state, you can apply the iceberg process to this, or metaphor to this one as well, right? So the very tip of the water, it's the unconscious, everything above the water, conscious mind. The larger portion just beneath that conscious mind represents that subconscious mind, and then the vast, deep underwater represents that unconscious mind. So while these all play a role in how we assess decision-making process, the unconscious mind really holds a deep-seated fears and bias. But the subconscious mind is the most significantly impacts psychological safety. And this is through the beliefs or the attitude or the automatic responses, right, it holds. So again, why do people stick their hands inside machinery and moving equipment? To that, we look at the different aspects of that subconscious mind. Some of that might be risk perception, right? A worker who's familiar with a machinery and they've had previous experience may underestimate the risk involved. It's something that they do frequently. They might be overconfident, right? Everybody is a superhero. Nobody's going to get injured. They can just do it once, right? So some of that risk perception could be impacting here. Environmental and situational factors, I think these come up quite a bit, but pressure. Outside of just the thoughts and the feelings and the conscious mind, there's a lot of outside things weighing on people. So pressure from tight deadlines, pressure from financial pressure, trying to lead workers to get the job done quicker, have shortcuts, not turning off the machine because it might slow them down, but not thinking with safety first. Fatigue and stress can also go into this. So the physical or mental fatigue or impairment of maybe doing something repetitively in that situation. Workplace culture and safety climate. And this is the environment that we build for our employees. So in our environment where safety is not prioritized, right? We prioritize deadlines, or we prioritize trying to meet our customers' needs ahead of safety. Workers are going to feel that pressure even more if that's built into the culture. Outside of direct culture, there's also the peer influence. So the person working beside you, how are they operating on a day-to-day? What are their values, and how do their values impact how you're working? If they work unsafely continuously, right, is that ever going to rub off on the person working beside them? Yes. And then lastly, a lack of training and awareness. I think this is one that we all know of, right? Inadequate trainings, workers are not trained based off of the safety procedures that they should be followed. Maybe there's some changes to the process that are not communicated to those workers. And then inattention to safety protocols. So maybe they know that there's safety protocols, but really nobody follows them consistently due to complacency, or they're just forgetful. So when we look at environmental factors that impact this human performance, I'm sure we've seen many pictures like the one I have on the screen right now, right? And I think the first thing that comes to mind is, how could they be doing this? What are they thinking? Are they even thinking, right? Are there any practices in place? Is anybody overseeing this? And I think that without asking the story behind this picture, it's hard to really fully grasp all the factors that are going into this decision, right? So here we have a forklift that's lifting up an aerial lift for two individuals to get something done, right? They have a pressure put on them to get to the next customer. They need this work to be done now. They're in a tight time pressurized cooker here. Then they also think, if I don't get done with this customer, it's going to impact the next customer. My boss is going to be mad at me because this could lose business for the company. There's a financial pressure that's also being put on these individuals. So what do? Well, I don't want my boss to get mad at me. And well, he's only given me the key to a forklift. I have an aerial lift, but he's only given me the key to the forklift. What do? And this is the way they solve it, right? So all of these factors are going into this decision on how we're working unsafely. With any processes, there's going to be human error. I think we have to accept that humans are going to make mistakes. Humans are going to find a way around a safety process that we put in place. But how do we prevent that? And how do we explain the reason why those processes are in place, the need for them, so that people don't try to circumvent those? So workers are going to do what makes sense to them, right? If there's resource constraints, there's that perception of fear or frustration that they're going to have, even anger as well. They're in a lose-lose situation. Either they call their superior and they say, hey, we don't have the key to the aerial lift. You know, their boss might get upset with them from a time perspective, or they find a solution around it, which is unsafe. They feel like they're in this lose-lose situation, so they're going to find a way around it without disappointing their boss or their customer. And they can even try to morally justify what they're doing, right? I'm doing my job. I don't want to get fired. I'm trying to feed my family. I will do whatever I need to feed my family. That's that moral justification. It doesn't mean it's right, but this is how people rationalize those unsafe actions that they take, right? And we can learn the hard way from these areas of failure. So we know psychological safety is important. We have a full understanding about what that is. We've given some examples to it. But how do we assess where we're at in our own journey when it comes to psychological safety? So psychological safety is a crucial element for fostering that health, productivity, innovative workplace. So without understanding where you're at in your journey and how comfortable your employees are about expressing their thoughts and their opinions without a fear of negative consequences, you don't know what actions to put in place. There is psychological safety in 4 stages, and this is Timothy R. Clark's definition and kind of stages of psychological safety. But I think it summarizes and helps people evaluate what bucket they fit into pretty well. So the first one here is going to be inclusion safety. So this is the foundation of psychological safety. This is where everybody feels that they're valued. It comes around when everybody is committed to addressing any bias, right? Promoting fairness and ensuring that everybody has a voice. You can create an environment like this through speaking in meetings, making sure everybody in the room has a time to speak, and then also having some eye contact with individuals, right? This just makes everybody feel like they're visible, a visible part of that organization, right? So that's an easy step, simple first step for psychological safety. The second one is learner safety, right? So once people feel like they're included in a group, they're much more likely to say, I have a question or I have some feedback. They might speak up about a mistake, right? Because they don't have that fear of punishment. They do feel like there's an open conversation going on. So you can do this by emphasizing things that you've learned in your past. I've made mistakes, I've done this, and this is how we've corrected them. Being vulnerable with our employees, right? That's that learner safety when we get to that piece. Contributor safety, and this one's about feeling energized and active to contribute your ideas and expertise. So instead of sitting back and just following a process or doing your job, you actively communicate your suggestions, right? They share their insights, their takeaways, the things that they've learned. And somebody who might sit in this stage could be setting up forums or kind of taking one-on-ones with individuals and asking for their feedback about a system. And then the last stage is really the highest stage of psychological safety, but it's this challenger safety. So this is the stage where people feel comfortable challenging the status quo, proposing innovative ideas, and providing the constructive criticism. This one's hard because it does require the leaders of an organization to create this environment for the group. So it's a really strongly leaning on our leadership buy-in for this. So people often still feel nervous to make a leap to bring up some of those criticisms, but I think you can help others feel comfortable with this by explaining a new process that you want to put in place, right? And the steps that you took to understand what goes into that and why you're making that suggestion. So what data did you look at? Why you thought that this was a good idea, but explaining to your employees what steps you took so that they can follow in those footsteps. So 4 stages of psychological safety. We know these buckets, but how can we assess where we're at in our journey? So one easy way to do this is employee surveys. So doing these anonymously is a great way to gather feedback when we give a name to a response, it tends to curve some of the responses that we get, right? And we do want candid feedback from our employees. So surveys, questionnaires, I have examples up on here, but I think these are 5 great key areas to start with when you're asking about your employees' perception as it relates to psychological safety. So I think in general, trying to ask them, do they feel safe to express their true feelings at work? Can they bring up problems and tough issues with their team? You could do this on a 1 to 5 rating scale, a 1 to 10 rating scale, but really evaluating how those employees feel. Support from colleagues, right? And we talked about how peers work within this, and there can be some peer pressure, but my colleagues value my input and ideas. My team members are open to giving and receiving feedback. Responses to mistakes. So mistakes are treated as an opportunity to learn versus blaming others. How do your employees feel when they bring up a mistake? Do they feel like they can do that without reprimand? Right. Inclusivity is a big one. I know there's a lot of DEIs going around. A lot of companies, I think it's great, but trying to drive perceptions from diverse groups, I think is very valuable in this. So inclusivity, asking your employees if they feel included in all aspects of safety, in all aspects of decision making. And then leadership support. Employees can't do this alone, or supervisors can't do this alone. Top leadership does need to be involved and kind of showcase and be the leader for saying psychological safety is important at our companies, right? So does my manager demonstrate this for me? Does my leadership encourage honest communication? I think those are some great survey questions to add. Outside of surveys and questions, interviews work as well. So conducting focus groups, and this could be a group of diverse employees, right? Diversity is key here, from different parts of the company, asking them about their perceptions about things that have gone on in their day-to-days and how that's impacted the business. Even asking some of those questions that you might ask in the survey to that general group and getting some feedback. Individual one-on-ones is a great way to have some face-to-face to make your employees feel like they care about you, but it also gives you the deeper insights into specifics. If there's a specific situation that's going on that Jason felt very pressured to do something and had to work around and actually created an unsafe event, he might share that with you in a one-on-one, but might first be reluctant to do that in a group setting. So individual interviews are a great way to do this too. We're not doing surveys, we're not doing interviews, or we're already doing those and we want to add on here. Just sitting back and observing your workforce is a great thing to do, right? First, team interactions. So you observe your teams in a meeting. Do they speak over each other? Do they share ideas and let everybody speak and everybody have a turn? There was a study done once at a Google, and they were trying to study to identify what were some of the components that actually went into the performance of their teams, right? So what are the social norms of different groups that showed high performance? And what they saw was that teams who in a team setting spoke over each other, didn't let others have a chance to speak, they actually performed lower than the teams that let everybody have a second to explain their thoughts and opinions on each of their projects. So I thought that was a good example that explains team interactions really go into building that psychological safe environment, but also go into higher performance of our employees. Conflict resolution. So there's going to be conflict. People are going to disagree from time to time. But when your teams have this conflicts, how do they resolve those? Do they just never go unresolved? Are they resolved respectfully? I think having a observation of those behaviors is going to tell you a lot about how your company's doing for psychological safety. And then offering suggestions. So if an employees are willing to take some steps, right? They're willing to provide suggestions. Do they still have a fear of kind of being humiliated or having negative consequences of speaking up? You know, when you're observing your teams, do you have somebody and you're just looking at them and I know that they want to speak up. I know that they want to say something, but it just looks like they're not going to, right? And maybe that's that culture that we've had, and they don't feel comfortable sharing their thoughts and their opinions on that. Outside of observations, behavioral indicators, we do have a couple psychological safety assessments. I have two that I have on the screen right now. Both of these are done by Amy Edmondson. She's a Harvard professor, and she really led the way for really how we assess psychological safety in the workplace. What buckets that we put our employees into, how do we evaluate that holistically and grow? So on the left-hand side here, it's the Fearless Organization scan, and this is really scoring your organization on 4 different domains. So really looking through 4 lenses. First, the willingness to help, right? How willing are your employees to help others? If somebody has an issue, do they speak up? Do they offer assistance, right? Inclusions and diversity. How diverse are our companies? Do we make everybody feel comfortable regardless of their background? Attitudes towards risk and failure, right? So if something goes wrong, if there is a failure, how do we address that? How does the company view that? And how do we move forward from that? And then the last view here is this open conversation piece. Do people speak well with each other? Do they share their thoughts and their feelings about things? On the right-hand side, we have, this is the Psychological Safety Index, or PSI. And I think there's a misconception here that you can either have psychological safe environment or you can hold your employees accountable. So I think it's a give and take for both of these, but really when we're trying to bucket people, we want to consider that we want an environment that's psychological safe, that allows people to speak up, but we also want to hold our employees accountable. So if we're not having a psychological safe environment and we don't have the accountability here, it just falls into this bottom left corner. They're apathetic, right? They're just showing up to show up and do their job, right? But if we build out that psychological safe environment and we don't hold them accountable, our employees are just going to be complacent, right? There's nothing saying you need to hit these standards. They just feel comfortable. They will speak up, right? But they just feel comfortable with doing what they need to do from a quality or a time or a work perspective. Whatever gets done, gets done. The box right here in the right corner, this anxiety box, it's kind of the scary box because it means that we're valuing that time pressure or that financial pressure above the psychological safe environment. So outside of them being in this high accountability, right, they're also in an area where they can't speak up about it. So when something negative happens, they're not going to bring that to the forefront, even though they're at high accountability. And where we want everybody is in this top right box, right? The growth development box, where we have fostered a psychological safe environment for our employees, but we're also holding them accountable to achieve KPIs and making sure that they're performing to their best of their abilities. So we've talked about some surveys, observations, one-on-one meetings, uh, some safety uh, assessments that we could do. Two other things I think with evaluating your company's performance around psychological safety. The first one of those ladders being feedback mechanisms, right? I think these are important from a checks and balance to say, what do we already have in place? What feedback loops do we already have in place, or what are we lacking so that we know what we need to implement? So I think regular check-ins, pulse surveys, trying to figure out and monitor any changes in trends with psychological safety over time. So not just a one-time check-in, but continuous check-ins to see how things fluctuate. Do we have something like that in place? Even if it is those one-on-ones that we mentioned, or even if it is a surveys, do we have a scheduled time frame where we're sending those out to check in with our employees, or maybe we just did it once and we said once is good enough, right? Do we have open door policies at our company? So that ensures that leaders, management, can hear the voices or concerns from our employees without any fear of reprimand. Right? Leadership practices. So evaluating your leaderships on their behaviors, they should be the role models for these behaviors. They should be practicing exactly what their employees should be doing. So showing that vulnerability. Do we have leaders and positions that are doing that today? And then do we have 360 feedback? I know a lot of companies have implemented this, but being able to provide that feedback on how the leadership group goes really helps us identify if there is a pain point in that chain. And then the last way I want to hit on for trying to evaluate where we're at in this psychological safety journey would be some performance metrics. So we can gather these throughout all the things I listed above, but how do we compare these? So employee engagement, how do we evaluate how our employees are satisfied at different levels? And how does that relate to their psychological safety? Turnover and absenteeism. What is our turnover rate? Does this increase or decrease throughout the years or months? And do we know the root cause of that? And have we evaluated that, how it impacts the psychological safety of that environment? Innovation and collaboration. We talked about this with amongst teams, but have we assessed the levels of innovation and collaboration? High psychological safety typically correlates with high innovation. So if we have people speaking up and sharing their suggestions, if we have process improvements, usually those go very close to psychological safety. There's also industry comparisons and best practices here. So industry comparisons, when we're thinking about benchmarking, right? How is our company doing compared to other like companies? For Bob's construction and Sarah's construction, right? They were doing the same exact scope of work, but they were completely different companies. If we're comparing those two, Bob's going to be farther along on that safety journey, or on that psychological safety journey, than Sarah's construction. And then best practices, learning from companies. There are plenty of companies who have shared their thoughts, have shared their difficulties that they've had in the past around psychological safety. So learning from some of those and implementing that. So trust is probably the foundational thing for psychological safety, right? When we think about building trust, the only way that our employees are going to speak up is if they trust us. I'm going to use an example that we probably ran through a couple times in different safety meetings, but the Boeing 737 max 8 issues, right? We had 2 flights, very similar flights, but we had Lion Air 610 that happened on October 29th, 2018, and we have Ethiopian Air Flight 302, which happened on March 10th, 2019. And both of these were fatal crashes, right? 346 people lost their lives in both of those crashes. And there's so many similarities for these, right? In both flights, there was a control system issue, right? Where the control system that was designated to prevent an aircraft's nose from pitching up, right, was implicated. So it was an issue with the aircraft identifying that the nose pitched up. There were also sensory malfunctions. So those sensory malfunctions indicated that the nose pitched up, so they continuously caused the nose of that craft to pitch down. Pilot responses were similar in both of these cases. So pilot crashes, or the crashes both indicated that pilots tried their best to override those issues, but despite their best attempts, they couldn't correct it. There was lack of training and information on these issues that were being experienced. So pilots were not adequately informed or trained about those issues, and if they occurred, how to correct them. And then there was some regulatory oversight that the FAA included after they had kind of reviewed that. So they really needed to look into some of those safety assessments that were done for those 2 aircrafts. Now, part of the investigation that they did ask a lot of questions to their employees. And I think some of the takeaways there really show lack of trust. So the panel, when they interviewed some of these employees, really found that there was a major disconnect between their senior management and how frontline employees felt safety was prioritized, right? What's more important, getting your job done quicker in a timely manner, getting that plane out the door, or is it the safety of that aircraft? Employees had concerns, but they were afraid to lose their job if they spoke up, right? And this goes into building that culture where nobody's afraid of reprimand. Employees didn't know what safety metrics that they were working towards, right? They probably knew the quantity of what they needed to do, the output of what they needed to do, but they didn't know the safety metrics that they were working for. Employees didn't know whether they had any issues that they raised in the past had been resolved. And this goes into the follow-up piece. We can't just say our employees are bringing us issues. That's great that they're bringing us issues, but that's going to slow down if they don't see the impact of those issues, if they don't see the steps that we're taking to correct those issues. 95% of employees said that they didn't know who Boeing's chief officer was. So this goes into the leadership. Psychological safety has to start at the leadership level. It has to have buy-in throughout the company and can't just be at the lower level. And then many employees did not trust that they could report issues anonymously. So it might say anonymously, but is it really anonymously? And this goes into buying in the trust of our employees, ensuring that they trust that processes, whether anonymously, we actually mean that they're anonymous when you are reporting these. So trust being the fundamental core elements of this psychological safety. I have 4 of them listed out here, but first kind of starting out with the integrity piece. So being truthful and transparent in our interactions is going to help build this. That honesty, credibility is built up. Also adhering to strong moral principles or ethical principles or standards ourselves, practicing what we're trying to get our employees to do, and then taking accountability, making sure that owning up for your mistakes and here are the learnings that I'm taking away from this, and fostering that culture of trust, right? When we share those experiences with our employees, they're going to trust us more. Competence. So demonstrating any necessary skills or expertise to perform your role efficiently really helps ensure others that you're competent and capable of doing that role. Also showing commitment to learning and improving. What are some things that you want to do to move the court, right? What are some education pieces that you're taking to better yourself so that your workforce can see that and strive for that and really build that trust up? Effectively addressing and resolving issues as they arise. We talked about this. We can't just listen to our employees and not take any actions. We do have to explain those actions that we take and share that back with our employees. Consistency, repetitiveness, reliability, predictability, I think is key with this. We can't just do this once, it's an ongoing process. So being dependable and consistent on the way that we address things, our interactions that we have, predictability, it really creates that ability for your employees to say, they've acted this way in the past when an issue has come up. I feel comfortable, confident. I trust my leader, so I can go to them and explain the issue now because I know that I won't have any reprimand there. Fairness, also treating everybody the same, goes into consistency. There's no bias based off of the team that they're on, what they look like. Trying to keep everything consistent regardless of who is bringing up any issues. And then communication. So being open, being honest, transparent. We've talked about that a couple times, but sharing this information openly, making sure that everybody has visibility into things really goes a long way in building that trust. Actively listening to employees when they bring something up, when they're speaking, let's pay attention to them, understanding, which builds that. So those are really the 4 core elements of trust, but how do we add these building blocks into our trust processes in our own company? So first, with active listening and empathy. So I guess an example of this one would be during a team meeting, you have a colleague that shares their opinion and you don't chime in, you don't say anything, but you actively listen, right? You nod your head, you make eye contact with that employee. And then after they're done speaking, you summarize their points to ensure that you understood correctly, and then ask some follow-up questions. It's a great way to show that you're actively listening, right? You have empathy. So if a team member expresses frustration around a challenging project, you might try to dismiss your feelings, but instead of doing that, what we should do is acknowledge their frustration, and say, I can see this situation or this project really frustrates you. What can I do to make it more manageable, right? Showing empathy to those employees. Vulnerability and admitting mistakes. So in a team meeting, you could share a story about a time that you struggled with a similar project, how you overcame it, right? It really shows that comparison of you're not alone in this situation. Others have been in this situation, they've overcome this, and we can get through it together. With admitting mistakes, you can always point out an error. I think it's important that if we do take missteps, regardless of where we're at in the company, we take our responsibility for that and say, my bad, I sent the wrong presentation, let me correct that now. Constructive feedback. So in a performance review, you might highlight what an employee is doing really well, but also suggest opportunities for growth. How do I move the ball? How do I get to that next position? Recognition and appreciation of teams' contributions. Many different ways to do this. I know a lot of companies have like shout out processes. Our company does this as well. We have a weekly meeting with our entire company, and any team that wants to shout out another member is able to do those, and those are put on the screen before our weekly meeting. So it's a great way to recognize employees and say, thank you for all your work, thank you for all your help. A couple more slides for psychological safety. I'm going to try to get through these a little bit quicker so that we do have some time for some Q&A. We know the importance of psychological safety. I think if we just look at it through a lens of data, right? If we have some data-driven individuals on the call, right now about 3 in 10 employees really don't feel like only 3 in 10 employees feel like their opinions seem to count at work, right? So how do we move that, which is what we've kind of talked through, and what is the implications of that? Well, the implications of that is if we can get 3 more of those employees to feel comfortable at our workplace, to feeling like they're valued and that their opinions are valued, the output of this is a 27% increase, or sorry, reduction in turnover, right? So we're retaining our employees. We have a 40% reduction in safety incidents and 12% increase in productivity of our workforce. So the output of putting these in place isn't just making employees feel good, right? Feeling like they have an opinion. It's also going to make us better companies through the lens of safety, through the lens of quality, through the lens of operations. So how do we foster a psychological safe workplace? First, creating an inclusive environment. You can do this by having diverse inclusion programs. So I know a lot of companies have those DEIs that they put in place, and this really ensures people from different backgrounds feel like they can speak up. They have a group to share experiences and processes and provide suggestions to the company. There's also you could have some employee resource groups in place. So where they can come together and offer support and enhance professional development. So coupling some senior individuals with maybe some new individuals at the company here to have a more inclusive culture. And then inclusive language practices. I've spoken about this in the past, but when we look at how we start emails, or if we start meetings, I know I am also guilty of this, using the term, hey guys, hi guys, how are you guys doing, right? That's very gender specific. So trying to use inclusive languages and best practices. Also encouraging that open communication. You can do this by regular team meetings, having those anonymous feedback channels, whether that's a survey. The open door policy is a great way to incorporate that encouraging of open communication. When you have a psychological safe environment, you're also going to get individuals who help support that innovation. So having innovative challenges. Maybe it's an internal kind of Shark Tank type of idea where everybody throws out their opinions or ideas that improve a process, and we evaluate those. I think that's a great way to get people involved. So more like an idea incubation program where we can evaluate that, and more of a fail forward culture, right? Promote a culture that accepts that every idea isn't going to be a great idea, but let's evaluate every idea to make sure that we're supporting innovation. And then providing some training and development. So offer training around leadership. If we have people moving into managing roles, making sure that we prepare them and build them up as much as we can so that they can foster that psychological safe environment, right? We have the skills and development and workshops that we've provided to them. And then career development plans, making sure that everybody knows that there is a step forward, right? It builds that culture of saying, they feel comfortable of saying, here's where I want to go in my personal goals. How can you help me get there, right? If you don't have those conversations, you don't know. So really trying to ensure that people are communicating some of those career development plans. with any system that we put in place, we do have the planning, doing, check, act. So I did throw this slide on here. So when we're thinking about assessing our workplace and understanding where we're at in our journey, we're planning that, we're gaining that context, maybe gathering some baseline survey information, right? That's that planning aspect of the PDCA. Doing, right? What are the steps that we're going to take? And I just ran through a couple of those to help change the culture of the psychological safety at our workplace. And then check this. So this is a continuous process. It's not a one and done. We need to evaluate any steps that we put in place. Did they work? Did they have an impact on our business, right? And then act to improve. If you see that things went well, what are some new things that we can implement? What are some things that we haven't tried yet that we should be implementing? I do want to hit on this standard just because we are having some consensus standards that touch on psychological safety. So there are guidelines for this. So ISO 45003 is touching on this. And really the aim here is to help organizations manage psychological or psychosocial risk within their health and safety management systems. So it has the organization of work, and this includes roles, responsibilities, job control, autonomy, job demands aspects, but it also includes the social factors at work. And this is that interpersonal relationship, the relationships with my leadership group, how the org flows, right? Recognition, reward systems. And then the last slide that I'm really going to end on here is trying to make sure that our workforce, one, feels comfortable, but two, also knows that they're part of a larger picture. So there's a kind of a old story about bricklayers here providing a purpose to your employees. You have 3 bricklayers and you're talking to all 3 of those bricklayers, and you ask bricklayer 1, hey, what are you doing? And bricklayer 1 says, well, I'm laying bricks, right? And you go over to bricklayer 2 and you say, hey, bricklayer, what you doing? And they say, well, I'm just trying to feed my family, right? And then you go to bricklayer 3 and you say, what are you doing? And they just say, I'm trying to help build a city, right? So giving our employees a larger purpose, a larger insight into the bigger picture really helps build that trust, build that psychological safety culture. I do want to thank you guys all for who you are, being a leader in safety. You guys are needed, you are making a difference, and I think we do play a very important role in everybody's lives and ensuring that they go home safe. I think we have a quick 3 minutes for some Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. Before we start the Q&A, we remind everyone of the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this webinar, and your input is important because it does help us improve our future webcast. As a reminder to our attendees, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And once again, if we don't get to your question, all unanswered questions, we forward it along to our speakers. Okay, now let's get to our first question. What are the common barriers to building psychological safety in the workplace?
Yeah. I think we touched on a couple of these throughout the presentation, but I think mainly common barriers that we're going to see include hierarchical organizational structures, right? Ensuring that there's not a disconnect between open communication. If we have an employee who reports to a supervisor and a supervisor that reports to a manager and a manager that reports to a director, if there is anybody in that chain, right, who makes or who doesn't build that psychological safe environment for the people reporting through them, it's gonna be kind of a stopper there, right? So trying to take a look at our hierarchical structures and are there checks and balances. That's why that 360 review is a great way to incorporate some feedback, get some perceptions from our employees if they feel very confident of bringing things up to their direct leader.
Well, it looks like we have time for one more question. How can we measure the impact of psychological safety on our team's performance?
Yeah. So to measure some of the impact of psychological safety, I would say first understand where you're at from a baseline perspective. So at the very starting point, where are we at on our safety or our psychological safety journeys, right? And then look at some key performance indicators. This could be employee engagement, it could be retention rates, productivity metrics. All of those are directly tied to psychological safety. So I would say gather as many KPIs as possible at the beginning and see how those changed as you've implemented some of these best practices in psychological safety.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We'd like to thank Nicole Osborne, the entire team from our sponsor, Avetta, and of course, all of you who joined us today. Take care and have a safe day.